For 5 years, he didn't look at her. Not once. And then she started coming home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly, a man who feared nothing on earth could not sleep. This is that story. Chicago was doing what Chicago does best at 3 o'clock in the morning, breathing cold and minding its business. The skyline glittered 42 floors below, indifferent and beautiful, the kind of view that cost more in silence than in square footage. And up in that penthouse, all glass walls and gray marble and the kind of quiet that had teeth, Cappy Me was sitting in the dark, not sleeping, not working, just sitting in a chair he never used in a corner of the living room he never occupied, watching the front door with the stillness of a man who had spent 15 years making other men disappear. His shirt was open at the collar. His jaw was tight. On the coffee table in front of him sat a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, because his hands weren't steady enough to lift it without betraying something, and KP Me did not betray things. The clock on the wall read 3:04 in the morning. Then the door opened. Joyce walked in the way she always walked, like the room had been waiting on her permission to exist. She was wearing a red dress the color of a final warning, her natural hair crowned full and unapologetic, shoulders back, up by spine straight. Her designer heels were already in her hand before she crossed the threshold. She'd taken them off in the hallway outside where she thought no one was watching. She moved through the penthouse without turning on a single light. She knew every inch of this place by feel. She hummed something low and unhurried under her breath, a jazz melody, something bluesy and private, something that wasn't for him. She walked past him like he was furniture, not with anger, not with pain, with the particular, devastating calm of a woman who had long ago finished grieving something she was still living inside of. She set her heels down by the kitchen island, opened the refrigerator, pulled out a sparkling water, and disappeared down the hallway toward the bedroom they no longer shared. She never looked at him once. And KP Me, the man Chicago's underworld called the Fixer, the man who had never flinched, never hesitated, or never lost, sat in his chair in the dark and felt something crack open in his chest that he had no name for. That one detail. That single, small, devastating detail, a woman walking through her own home at 3 o'clock in the morning, heels already off, humming a song he didn't recognize, moving through his presence like he was made of air, tells you more about this marriage than 5 years of silence ever could. But to understand how Joyce ended up here, it was drifting through a glass penthouse like a ghost who had decided she wasn't haunting anything anymore. We have to go back. Back 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Back before she was Joyce Park, back when she was just Joyce, Sweet J, big laugh, bigger instincts, the kind of woman who could read a room, a man, and a situation simultaneously and never let any of them know she was doing it. She grew up on the south side of Chicago in a brownstone apartment where the radiator knocked every winter, and her mother, Miss Rena, a woman built from church hats, hard truths, and the finest side-eye God ever gifted to a human being, raised her to be soft enough to love and sharp enough to survive. Miss Rena had 3 forms of communication: scripture, silence, and the look. All 3 could stop a grown man in his tracks. Joyce inherited 2 of them and improved on the 3rd. But her best friend was Camille, Cammy, a woman who was Joyce's opposite in every beautiful, necessary way. Where Joyce moved quietly and observed everything, Cammy arrived loudly and disturbed everything, and somehow always ended up being right about it. She had the kind of loyalty that didn't ask questions until after the crisis, and the kind of mouth that started conversations she absolutely planned to finish. They had been inseparable since high school. Since the night Cammy sat down at Joyce's piano and played 3 wrong notes with complete confidence and said, "I feel like music." Joyce had laughed so hard she cried. She still did sometimes when she let herself remember. It was Cammy who dragged her to the charity gala at the Langham Hotel on a Thursday night in November 5 years ago. Black tie, live orchestra. The kind of crowd where people smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. Joyce was not impressed. She had performed for rooms like this her whole life. She knew the difference between people who loved music and people who used it as wallpaper. She was about to tell Cammy she was leaving when she saw him. He was standing near the far end of the bar, Korean, tall, in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored for a man who was never planning to move quickly, but could if he had to. He wasn't drinking, wasn't talking, wasn't on his phone. And he was just standing there with a glass of something clear and untouched, looking at nothing, like a man whose mind was operating in a completely different city than his body. And neither city was this room. Joyce had never been able to leave a quiet person alone. The kind of quiet he had wasn't peace, it was discipline. And she had spent enough years performing in jazz clubs to know the difference between a man who had nothing to say and a man who was choosing, very carefully, not to say it. Me, she walked over. And KP me, a man who had trained himself to feel nothing, notice nothing, want nothing that could be used against him, noticed everything. The way she moved through the crowded gala like the room had a current, and she was the source of it. The way her eyes swept the space with the quiet precision of someone who understood environments, who read rooms the way other people read menus, quickly, efficiently, and always knowing exactly what she was going to order before she arrived. She was wearing a deep burgundy gown that night, her natural hair pinned up in a way that looked effortless and was almost certainly not, her brown skin catching the chandelier light in a way that made the diamonds on every other woman in the room look suddenly tired. She stopped beside him at the bar with the ease of someone who had decided, somewhere between the crowd and where he was standing, that this was going to happen. Standing alone at a gala, she said, not looking at him, signaling the bartender, is basically a public announcement. Kai P. Me looked at her slowly. An announcement of what? She glanced at him then, direct, unbothered, like she'd already calculated his answer and found it mildly interesting. That you're either the most important person in the room or the most dangerous one. Sometimes both. She accepted her drink. Which one are you? He didn't answer. She smiled, not the performance kind, not the gala kind, the real kind, the quiet, private kind that lived in the corner of a mouth and said, I already know the answer. I just wanted to hear what you'd say. Joyce, she said, extending her hand. KP, he replied. And for the first time in years, he shook someone's hand, not as a transaction, but as something that felt dangerously close to a beginning. That was 5 years ago. Now he was standing in the kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning, me holding a coffee he didn't want, listening to the silence of an apartment that had 3,200 square feet of space and somehow felt smaller every day. Joyce had not come out of the bedroom. She rarely did before noon. She owned a jazz lounge, the Velvet Note, on the north side of the city, which meant her nights were long and her mornings belonged only to herself. He had built his schedule around that understanding. He was gone before she rose. He was home after she left. For 5 years they had occupied the same penthouse the way two ships pass in deep water, aware of each other, signaling nothing, altering course for no one. It had been his design, his choice, his sacrifice, or so he had told himself every morning for 1,826 mornings. But this morning, something was different. He set down the coffee and walked to her vanity, not her bedroom. She kept the vanity in its own dressing room off the hallway, and he stopped in the doorway. Her world lived in this room, perfume bottles arranged like a skyline, jewelry laid out with the precision of someone who thought carefully about what she put on her body and what message it sent. Photographs tucked into the mirror's frame. Cammy, Miss Rena, the staff at the lounge, a few faces he didn't recognize. He recognized everything. He had memorized this room through the security camera feeds he reviewed every night like homework. But this morning, something was out of place. Her handbag, a structured black leather piece she'd been carrying for the last 3 weeks, was sitting on the velvet stool with its clasp slightly open. He would not have noticed, except that Joyce was meticulous. She closed things. She aligned things. An open clasp on her bag was like a fingerprint left behind at a scene. It meant something had been removed in a hurry. He crossed to it. He was not a man who second-guessed himself, but he stood there for a full 10 seconds before he reached inside. Beneath a slim leather wallet and a tube of deep plum lipstick, his fingers found it, a set of 2 keys on a plain metal ring, no branding, no identification tag, and a magnetic key card with a Gold Coast address written on a strip of white tape in Joyce's handwriting. He turned the keys over in his palm. He knew every property he owned in this city. None of them used this key profile. These keys opened something he had not purchased. He stood there in her dressing room with the morning light coming gray and cold through the frosted window, and for the first time in 5 years, KP felt something move through him that wasn't control. It was the specific, nauseating sensation of a man who had just realized the story he'd been telling himself was missing entire chapters. He placed the keys back, exactly as he found them, open clasp and everything. Then he pulled out his phone and called the one man in Chicago who could find out who owned a Gold Coast address by noon. By midnight, he had the answer. By 12:15, he was parked across the street from a building on East Delaware in a black car with tinted windows, watching the entrance with the same flat patience he'd used on targets for 15 years. He told himself this was professional. He told himself this was about security, about the syndicate, about the possibility that someone had gotten close to his wife to get to him. He was lying to himself. He knew it. He sat with it anyway. At 1:47 in the morning, a car pulled up. Joyce stepped out. She was wearing all black, fitted trousers, a structured blazer, her hair pulled back tight at the nape of her neck. No jewelry, flat shoes, a laptop bag slung across one shoulder, and a burner phone in her right hand. She moved with the focused efficiency of someone who was not going to a dinner, not meeting a lover, not doing anything that resembled the story his jealousy had been building for 72 hours. She looked like a CEO walking into a board meeting at 2 o'clock in the morning. She used the key card. The door opened. She didn't look back. He sat in the car for a long time after she disappeared inside. The building had 12 floors. The lights on the 7th floor came on 3 minutes later. He could see the faint blue wash of multiple screens through the partially open blinds. The screens. Multiple screens. In an apartment he didn't own, on a floor she accessed with a key he wasn't supposed to know existed, at 2 in the morning, when she was supposed to be finishing her last set at the lounge. KP sat back in the driver's seat. His jaw was tight. His hands were still. The hollow thing in his chest had not gone away, but it had shifted, rearranged itself into something colder and more precise than jealousy. Something that felt much more like fear. Because there was only one type of person in his world who built private rooms full of servers and burner phones and off-book addresses, and it wasn't a woman who was having an affair. He drove home in silence. He did not sleep. The next morning, he made breakfast. This was unusual enough that Joyce stopped walking through the kitchen and stood at the entrance to it, one hand resting lightly on the door frame. It is studying him the way you study something that has changed position overnight. A piece of furniture moved, a window that was previously closed now open. He was at the stove. Eggs, simple, deliberate. He'd made coffee. Her kind, the dark roast with cardamom that she'd been buying since before they were married. The cup was already on the island, black, no sugar, positioned exactly where she would stand if she chose to stay. She chose to stay. She set her phone face down on the counter, he noted that, and pulled the mug toward her. She was wearing an oversized cream sweater and small gold hoops, her hair loose around her face in soft coils, no makeup. This was the version of Joyce that nobody at the lounge ever saw, the unperformed version, the version that had lived in this apartment for 5 years and never once been asked how she was doing. The guilt hit him low and quiet. He didn't let it show. "You're home early," she said. It was not an accusation, not a question, just an observation, delivered with the neutral precision of someone who had long ago stopped reading emotion into his behavior. Meeting was moved. He plated the eggs and slid them across the island toward her. She looked at the plate, then at him. Then, with the particular composure of a woman who had decided not to be surprised by anything, she picked up the fork. They ate in silence. He was used to silence. He had manufactured it, sustained it, and weaponized it for 5 years. But this silence felt different from his side of it now. It had texture, weight. He was listening, not for what she said, but for everything she didn't, the way her breathing was even and measured, the way she didn't reach for her phone once, the way she sat across from him like a woman who had decided, at some point he couldn't identify, to become completely unreadable. He had done that to her. But he understood it now with a clarity that arrived too late and landed too hard. He had spent 5 years teaching Joyce Park how to be invisible, and she had been an excellent student, better, it turned out, than he had ever been. He leaned forward, a slight shift, barely perceptible, just enough to close 2 inches of the distance between them on the pretext of reaching for the salt. And there it was. Faint, expensive, unmistakable. A cologne he had known for 15 years, a custom blend, oddly commissioned from a perfumer in Seoul, worn by exactly one man in the city of Chicago, Juan, the syndicate elder, the man who had sat across from KP Me on the night of his wedding and said, "A shadow with a heart is a shadow that can be stepped on," and in doing so had authored the last 5 years of this marriage. KP Me set down the salt. His face did not change. His hands did not move. He had been trained since he was 23 years old to contain reaction. He needed to let nothing live on his surface. But something was happening underneath, something vast and structural, like a foundation shifting. Joyce raised her eyes from her plate and looked at him. And for just a fraction of a second, not long enough to confirm, too long to dismiss, something moved behind her expression, a flash of awareness, an acknowledgement, on something that looked terrifyingly like a woman who had expected this moment and had decided exactly what she was going to do when it arrived. Then it was gone, smooth as water closing over a stone. "Good eggs," she said, and she went back to eating. He received a call at noon. A routine matter. He took it because he needed to move his body through space, because sitting still inside his own thoughts had started to feel like a specific variety of dangerous. He was distracted. But he knew he was distracted the way a surgeon knows when their hands aren't steady, not with panic, but with the sober, clinical acknowledgement that the gap between knowing and correcting it was where people got hurt. There was a moment, one moment, where his mind was not on the room he was standing in. It was in a kitchen in a 42nd floor penthouse, watching a woman eat eggs, trying to decode what her stillness meant. He drove back to the city with his jaw set and the windows down, despite the cold, the November air sharp enough to cut through the noise in his head. His phone buzzed. An unknown number, one text. "The ghost is talking. Are you listening?" He read it twice, then he pulled over and sat there for a long time with the hazards blinking and the traffic roaring past and the taste of something he hadn't felt in 15 years sitting heavy at the back of his throat. He was afraid. Not of Juan. Not of the syndicate. Not of whatever Joyce had built in that Gold Coast apartment. He was afraid of what it said about him, about the quality of his protection, the cost of his logic, the cathedral of silence he'd built in the name of keeping her safe, that the most dangerous move on the board had been made not by his enemies. It had been made by his wife. He went back on a Thursday night, not to watch from the car this time. He went inside. It took him 11 minutes to get through the building's security, not because it was weak, but because it was good, and undoing good security quietly required patience and a specific kind of focused attention that his current emotional state was not naturally producing. He took his time. He breathed. He worked. The 7th floor. He used a bypass tool on the apartment door, and it swung open into darkness. The apartment was not a home. There was no furniture in the conventional sense, nothing that suggested anyone slept or ate or lived here. What filled the space instead were 2 long tables running parallel down the center of the main room, each holding a configuration of laptops, external hard drives, and monitors. Along the left wall, a row of physical file cabinets, locked, labeled in a handwritten system he didn't immediately recognize. Along the right, a corkboard that ran the full length of the wall, covered in photographs, printed documents, strings of red thread connecting points in a pattern that was not random. That was very, very deliberately not random. He walked to the corkboard first. He recognized faces, names, dates, shipment routes, properties, financial structures that should not have existed anywhere outside of 3 encrypted servers in a building whose address only 6 people in the city knew. Joyce had not been documenting the syndicate from the outside. She had been mapping it from the inside, thread by thread, transaction by transaction, for what the volume of material on this wall suggested was not months, years. He moved to the file cabinets. He pulled the first one he recognized and opened it. Thorough, sourced, annotated in Joyce's handwriting, precise, angular, nothing like the soft looping cursive she used in personal notes. This was a different handwriting, professional, focused. The handwriting of someone who had been trained to document or had trained herself. Then he found the folder at the back of the 3rd drawer. It was not labeled with a syndicate name. It was labeled KP. He opened it with less steadiness than he would have liked. Photographs. A dozen of them printed on standard photo paper. Him. From a distance, a restaurant he frequented, the parking garage beneath the penthouse, a street corner outside a contact's office. Not surveillance photos. Not the clinical evidentiary documentation that filled every other folder in this cabinet. These were different. The angles were too human, the framing too careful. One of them, taken approximately 8 months ago, showed him standing outside the lounge after close, alone, looking up at the building. He hadn't known she was watching. She had been watching him the way he'd been watching her on the security feeds, from a distance, in the dark. Missing someone she was still technically married to. He sat down on the floor of that apartment and held a photograph of himself in his own hands, and understood for the first time, in his body rather than his logic, the full cost of what he had done. He had not protected Joyce by ignoring her. He had protected the syndicate's perception of Joyce. He had protected Juan's comfort level. He had protected the cold, cowardly logic of men who built power by making the people closest to them small. And Joyce, rather than becoming small, had become something else entirely. She had become the most dangerous person in his world, and she had done it quietly, in the spaces his silence had carved out, using the years he'd given her nothing in. He put the folder back. He closed the cabinet. He stood up and looked at the corkboard one last time. His eyes landed on a section in the bottom right corner, a cluster of documents connected by gold thread instead of red. The documents were financial records, offshore structures, hidden accounts, the kind of money that didn't exist on paper until someone with access and patience built the paper trail backward. The accounts belonged to Juan. And next to them, in Joyce's precise angular handwriting, was a single notation. He's planning to burn KP when the triad audit comes, pinning the discrepancy on the fixer. Timeline, 60 days. KP me read it once. Then he took a photograph of the entire board with his phone, let himself out of the apartment, and walked back to his car with the measured, unhurried stride of a man whose world had just changed shape. 60 days. Juan, his mentor, the man who had shaped him, the man whose cologne now lived on his wife's clothing, the man who had been using KP Me's own silence, his own syndicate logic, as the mechanism for a frame designed to end him. He sat in the car. He did not feel betrayed by Juan. He felt something colder than that, something that lived past betrayal, in the territory where a man stops grieving what he's lost and starts calculating what needs to happen next. He felt the specific, clarifying calm of someone who had just realized that the nightmare his enemies feared wasn't him. It had always been Joyce, and he had spent 5 years ignoring her. The Velvet Note was not the kind of jazz lounge that advertised. It had no sign on the front, just a brushed brass address plate beside a heavy oak door on a quiet block north of the river. Word of mouth only. Reservations 2 weeks out, a menu that changed nightly. And at the center of it, 6 nights a week, a woman with a voice that did something to a room. Something that wasn't technically describable in musical terms because it existed below the music, in the frequency where feeling lived before it became language. Ching KP Me had not been inside since opening night 5 years ago. He came on a Wednesday, late, after the last set had ended and the front staff had begun turning over tables. He wore a plain dark coat, no tie. The lounge was still half occupied, the after-set crowd, the ones who came for the music and stayed for the atmosphere. Low amber light, Miles Davis drifting through the room at a volume designed for conversation. The whole room smelled of leather and candle wax and the particular expensive quality of a space that had been built with intention. He found Joyce at the back. She was sitting at a small table in the corner of the room, a glass of red wine and a leather-bound notebook open in front of her, writing something in the soft, angular hand she used only for work. Her stage clothes still on, a fitted black trouser suit with a single gold button at the collar, her hair free and full around her face, and earrings catching the amber light. She looked up when she sensed him, not when she saw him. Before that, she sensed him the way people who have lived in proximity to a particular kind of energy learn to sense its approach. Her pen stopped. KP, not a question, not a greeting exactly, just his name, placed in the air between them like an object set on a table. Present, acknowledged, not yet interpreted. He sat down across from her without being invited. "You look tired," she said. "I need to talk to you." She said it back slowly, as if tasting it, as if the sentence were in a language she'd studied but had not heard spoken for so long she needed a moment to remember the pronunciation. Her expression was composed and unreadable, and there was something underneath it, not fear, something more complicated than that. An alertness, a readiness. The look of someone who had been waiting for a particular conversation for a very long time and had decided exactly how they were going to have it. "You've been going somewhere at night," he said. "Not the lounge. I own the lounge. I decide when I'm at the lounge. That's not what I'm asking." "Then ask what you're asking." He leaned forward. The table was small, 2 feet of it between them, which was the closest they had physically been to each other and longer than he wanted to calculate. He could see the small gold chain at her collarbone, could see the precise stillness she was maintaining, the slight tension at the line of her jaw that she was disciplined enough to keep out of her expression, but couldn't entirely keep out of her body. She was not afraid, but she was not indifferent. He reached across and placed his hand over hers on the notebook. Joyce looked at his hand, then at him. Something moved across her expression, a quick, unguarded thing, a here and gone in less than a second, somewhere between the ghost of something old and the sharp edge of something present. It lasted exactly long enough to make his chest constrict before her composure closed over it again. "You haven't touched me in 1,826 days, KP. Her voice was quiet and even, and it cut like something precision made. "Don't start now just because you're scared." He didn't move his hand. "I'm not scared." "Yes, you are. I know what you look like when you're running scenarios. I've had 5 years to study your face from across a room. You're running one right now." She was right. He pulled his hand back. "Juan," he said. The name landed in the space between them, and something changed in the atmosphere. A subtle recalibration, a shift in barometric pressure, the feeling of a room before a storm decides which direction to move. Joyce held his gaze for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook. "What about him?" she said. "You've been meeting with him." "I've been doing a lot of things, Joyce. KP. Her voice sharpened slightly, just slightly, the way a well-held blade catches light at a certain angle, just enough to show you the edge. "You want to ask me something? Ask it. Is he the reason you're safe?" Something shifted in her eyes, not softness, something more complicated than that. The look of a woman who had been handed a question that was both exactly right and entirely too late. "No," her voice was quiet. "I am the reason I'm safe." Outside the lounge's front windows, movement. He caught it in his peripheral, the slow, deliberate positioning of a car that didn't belong to this neighborhood, this block, this time of night. The unhurried kind of surveillance that assumed it hadn't been noticed. Juan's men. They weren't there for him. They were watching the lounge. They were watching her. He looked back at Joyce and found her already watching him with the knowing calm of someone who had clocked the same car 15 minutes before he arrived. "You know they're out there," he said. "I've known about them for 3 weeks. Why didn't you—" "Tell you?" She let that sit for a moment. "Tell you what, KP? Tell my husband, who hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, that the man who told him to ignore me is now sending people to watch me. Tell the man who built a cage around me and called it protection that the cage has started attracting attention." Her voice was even, controlled, not raised. She had never been the kind of woman who raised her voice when she could simply sharpen it. What exactly was the protocol for that conversation? He had no answer, because there wasn't one. She stood. She buttoned the single gold button at her collar. She picked up the notebook. "Juan is planning to frame you," she said. And her voice was flat and factual, stripped of drama, the way you deliver information when you've been sitting with it long enough that the shock is metabolized into strategy. "The triad audit is in 60 days. He's been moving money through your accounts for 8 months. By the time the auditors arrive, every discrepancy will trace back to you." She picked up her wine glass and finished what was left. "I've been meeting with Juan because he believes I'm angry enough at you to help him do it." She set the glass down. "He's wrong about why I'm angry, and he's wrong about what I'm willing to do with it." She looked at Katmee with an expression that was not warm, not cold, not forgiving, not yet, but was something more durable than any of those things. It was the look of a woman who had made up her mind about something important and was giving him one chance to be on the right side of it. "We have 60 days, she said. "The question is what you're going to do with that information." She walked toward the back of the lounge, pausing once at the door of her office. "And KP?" She didn't turn around. "Next time you want to know what I'm doing at 3 o'clock in the morning, ask me. I'm your wife. I was never the enemy." The door closed. He sat in the amber light of the velvet note for a long time. Outside, the car was still there. His phone buzzed, another unknown number. She told him tonight. Clock started. 59 days. He looked up at the closed office door. He stood. And as he was no longer running scenarios, he was choosing a side. She had known about the frame for 8 months, not a suspicion, not a feeling. A documented, sourced, annotated certainty that had lived in the third drawer of the second file cabinet in the Gold Coast apartment while she smiled through dinners she didn't attend, performed sets she barely remembered, and sat across from Juan in private rooms that smelled of aged whiskey and old power, all letting him believe she was angry enough to be useful. She had been many things during those 8 months. Angry was not one of them. Angry was a fire that burned the person holding it. Joyce had learned that early, from Miss Rena, from the South Side, from the particular education that came with being a woman in rooms that were not built for her. She had learned to take the heat of what she felt and compress it, densify it, turn it into something with structure and weight and purpose. The Knot of Fire, a blueprint. The Whisper Network had been Cammie's idea, technically. Or rather, it had been born in a conversation Cammie didn't know was a strategy session. They were at the lounge after close, 2 years into Joyce's golden cage existence, and Cammie, who had been dating one of the syndicate's mid-level associates for 6 months and had the specific kind of intelligence that came from being underestimated by powerful men, had leaned across the table and said casually, "And over a glass of Prosecco, you know all these men's women talk to each other, right? Like, they all sit in the same waiting rooms, same salons, same charity boards. They know everything. They just don't know they know everything." Joyce had looked at her best friend for a long moment. Then she'd said, "Tell me more about that." The Whisper Network was, on its surface, a social circle, a rotating dinner party. It was a group of women connected by proximity to powerful men who gathered every 3 weeks in private dining rooms and talked about their lives, their frustrations, the things they'd seen and heard and been told to forget. Joyce had built it slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that trust between women was not manufactured, but cultivated. She had not asked anyone for information. She had simply made herself a person worth trusting, and the information had arrived naturally, the way light arrives when you remove a wall. By the end of the first year, she had 12 women. By the end of the second, 19. By the third year, she had access, through the ordinary invisible intelligence of overlooked women, to more of the syndicate's operational reality than most of its senior members. And Juan had walked directly into the center of it. And he had approached her 14 months ago. A chance encounter at an art auction, she had known it wasn't chance, had spotted the design of it from 50 feet away, but had allowed the performance to proceed because she wanted to know what he was building. He was elegant about it, patient. He had spent 4 meetings simply being sympathetic, the understanding mentor figure, the man who had always secretly disagreed with KP Me's treatment of her. It was the one voice in the syndicate who thought she deserved better. He was skilled. He had done this before. She could see the architecture of his manipulation, the way a structural engineer sees load-bearing walls, clearly, technically, without emotion. She had let him believe it was working. She had let him move deeper into the performance, sharing small pieces of apparent bitterness about the marriage, apparent loneliness, apparent willingness to consider options. Each piece calculated. Each piece designed to make him feel like he was winning, while she quietly documented everything, every meeting, every implied instruction, every paper trail that connected his hidden accounts to the financial structures he was building inside KP Me's name. She had been playing Juan for over a year, and he had never once looked at the woman across the table and asked himself whether she might be playing him back. Because that was the thing about men who underestimated women. They did it so completely, so structurally, that it functioned as a blind spot rather than a choice. Juan had built his entire career on the premise that women adjacent to power were decorative rather than operational. It was the oldest mistake in the world. It was going to cost him everything. She told KP the shape of it that night, standing in the doorway of her office at the Velvet Note, giving him the overview in the measured, or factual tone she used for things she'd already processed completely. She watched his face as she spoke, the way his jaw adjusted when information recalibrated him, the way something moved behind his eyes when he was revising a position. He was doing it now, revising, recalibrating, reconstructing the last 5 years through the new geometry of what she was telling him. She finished. She waited. "How long have you known about the frame specifically?" he said. 8 months. Something crossed his face. She let it land without softening it. "You could have told you." She said it before he finished. "I know. But think about what you're saying. Think about what telling you would have required me to trust. At the point I discovered the frame, you and I had not had a real conversation in 4 years. You had not looked at me directly in 4 years. I had no idea whether you were part of it, whether Juan had gotten to you first, Whether telling you would end with me being erased from the board entirely. Her voice was even. No accusation. She had moved past accusation a long time ago. This was something colder and more precise than anger. It was the accounting of consequence. I had to protect myself. Because you had spent 4 years teaching me, very clearly, that no one else was going to do it. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before in this marriage. This one had texture. This one breathed. The Whisper Network, he said. How many women? 23. He absorbed that. And Juan doesn't know. Juan thinks I'm his source. She picked up her notebook from the table. He's been feeding me information he believes I'll use to move against you. Every piece he's given me has gone into the files. Every piece is documented and sourced and ready. She looked at him steadily. I have enough to take the entire senior structure down, not just Juan, all of it. But he was quiet for a long time. Outside, the car was still there. The 60-day timeline, he said. Can you move faster? I've been ready for 3 months. She was quiet for a beat. I was waiting. For what? She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a long time without the protective distance she'd learned to maintain, and she let him see a fraction of what lived underneath it. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the truth of what she'd been carrying, the weight of it. The specific loneliness of a woman who had spent 5 years building a fortress with her own hands because the person who was supposed to be beside her had decided silence was the same thing as safety. For you, she said. I was waiting for you to finally show up. She walked out, and this time when the door closed behind her, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a starting gun. They came on a Friday. Joyce knew before the elevator announced them. The Whisper Network had a member whose husband ran building security for 3 of the syndicate's real estate properties in the city, and she had sent a single message at 11:47 at night. 4 men, dressed for it, your building. Joyce was already at the piano when the elevator dinged. She was in the penthouse, their penthouse, the glass-walled cage she had refused to let become a coffin, and she had chosen the piano not for comfort, but for positioning. The piano sat at the far end of the main room, against the window wall, which meant her back was protected by 42 floors of altitude, and her sight line covered the entire space. She had learned how to think about rooms this way over the last 3 years. She had learned it quietly, the way she learned everything, by watching the men around her and understanding that the only difference between their safety and her danger was what they'd been taught to notice. BKP came through the penthouse door 40 seconds before the elevator reached their floor. He had known, she didn't ask how, and he came in hard and fast and stopped when he saw her at the piano, already still, already positioned, already calm. He looked at her. She looked at him. You're not running, he said. I don't run. Something moved through his expression that she hadn't seen in 5 years. It looked like recognition, the specific, an humbling recognition of a man who was seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, what he had chosen to ignore. He moved through the space with the particular economy of motion of someone who had been trained to neutralize threats in enclosed spaces. His jacket was off, the shoulder holster visible, and she watched him work with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. He came back to the center of the room. The network files, he said. Are they secured? Encrypted, backed up. As distributed across 3 separate servers with dead man protocols. She met his eyes. If anything happens to me, every document goes to the Federal Task Force, the Triads, Singapore auditors, and 3 investigative journalists simultaneously. She paused. I built the exit before I built the operation. He stared at her. Something in his face broke open, just briefly, just for a moment, before the operative in him closed it back up. But she saw it. She saw it completely. I have to go deal with them, he said. Stay. I'm not staying anywhere. She stood from the piano bench. She was wearing a deep wine-colored wrap dress, her natural hair loose and full, and she crossed the room to the kitchen island where, beneath the false bottom of a drawer she had installed herself 18 months ago, she retrieved a slim black burner phone and a tactical flashlight she'd had modified. She looked at him across the island with the composed certainty of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this moment. I know this building better than they do. And I know Juan's team. I've had eyes on them for 14 months. Third man on the team has a knee injury, right side. He'll be slower on the stairwell. She held his gaze. You need me. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Stay behind me. Not a command, more like a negotiation between two people who had only just figured out they were on the same side. Only until the stairwell, she said. He almost smiled. The elevator opened. What happened next in that penthouse was not confrontation in any simple sense. It was architecture. Two people who had spent 5 years in the same space, finally moving through it together, reading each other's positions, adjusting, covering, operating with the kind of wordless coordination that either takes years to develop or is already there. Already written into the specific frequency of two people who have been paying attention to each other even through the silence. KP Me moved through the threat with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this his whole life. Joyce moved through it with something different but no less effective. She knew the building, knew the team. And when the moment came that required distraction rather than force, she created it with the precise, unhurried confidence of a woman who had learned to turn being underestimated into a weapon. When it was over, when the building was quiet again, they stood together in the hallway outside the penthouse door, breathing. Not touching, not yet. But close. Closer than they had stood in 5 years. Not in the particular charged closeness of two people who have just survived something together and are recalibrating what the other one means. Joyce's hair had come loose on one side. Her dress was intact. She was breathing steady and her hands were still, which told him more about what she was made of than anything else she could have shown him. You modified the flashlight, he said, 18 months ago. Where did you learn? Camille's cousin, former military. He thought he was teaching me self-defense. She tucked the flashlight into her pocket. He was, partially. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. I'm sorry. It came out without architecture, without the careful management that characterized everything he said. Just the 2 words, stripped of everything, landing in the air between them with all the weight of 5 years attached to them. I told myself it was protection. I told myself every day that the distance was the point. That invisible meant safe. And you were standing right there, building something extraordinary, while you were watching me on security camera feeds. Her voice was quiet. I know. I found the access logs a year ago, his face. She had imagined this moment, the moment of full exposure, the moment when neither of them had anything left to hide behind, and she had imagined it would feel devastating. She had not imagined it would feel like this, like relief. Like setting down something so heavy she had stopped noticing its weight. Come inside, she said. And this time, when the door closed behind them both, it was the same door, but an entirely different room. Juan received the file on a Tuesday morning. He did not know how it arrived. It was there when he unlocked his private email at 7 o'clock, a single compressed folder, no sender address, containing 1,143 documents. He knew what they were before he opened them. The way a man knows the quality of bad news before the words arrive, by the particular stillness that precedes a catastrophic shift. He opened them anyway. 3 hours later, his personal attorney stopped returning his calls. By noon, his access to the syndicate's financial infrastructure had been quietly revoked. Not by KP Me, not by any visible hand, but by the layered consequence of 1,100 documents reaching the right people in the right sequence. The Singapore auditors had been the first notification. They had triggered the triad's internal compliance mechanism, which had triggered a secondary review, which had triggered the kind of quiet, institutional withdrawal of confidence that was, in the world Juan occupied, more lethal than any physical threat. He had built his career on the premise that information was power, and that the people closest to him were information-proof. He had kept his closest dealings verbal. His financial maneuvers layered through enough intermediaries to be untraceable by conventional means. He had believed, with the serene confidence of a man who had never been properly challenged, that the architecture of his protection was complete. He had not accounted for a woman who had spent 5 years with nothing to do but pay attention. The accounts were frozen by 2 o'clock that afternoon. Not seized, frozen. A technical distinction with enormous practical consequence, engineered through the financial intelligence Joyce had been building for 3 years and executed through a contact at the federal level whose wife had been a Whisper Network member since the 2nd year. $23 million. Juan's hidden accumulation, the skim, the redirected percentages, the slow architectural theft from the triad's partners that he had been executing for 8 years, all of it frozen, all of it documented, all of it within 48 hours redirected, legally, impermanently, with the impeccable paperwork of someone who had anticipated every countermove, to a domestic violence transitional housing organization on Chicago's West Side. Administered by a board whose chair was a woman named Rena, Miss Rena, who had built a casserole ministry out of a South Side apartment and who had no idea her daughter had just funded the next 10 years of her work. Joyce had not told her yet. She wanted to be there when she did. Lihorhoti. KP Me found Juan on the 48th floor of a building in the Loop, in a corner office that looked out over the same Chicago skyline that had watched everything unfold. He came alone. He came without a weapon because it told Juan clearly that this was not that kind of ending, that KP Me had decided his mentor's punishment would not be the clean final kind. It would be the kind that required him to keep living. Juan looked older than he had 4 days ago. The architectural confidence that had defined him, the way he occupied a room, the way he made silence feel like his property, had collapsed inward. He was still impeccably dressed, but the suit looked like a costume now. "You let her do this," Juan said. His voice was controlled, barely. Number KP Me stood just inside the office door. He didn't sit. She did this. I was late to it by about 5 years. But he looked at the man who had shaped him, who had handed him a philosophy of isolation and called it protection, and watched him dismantle his own marriage one silent day at a time, and felt something that surprised him with its simplicity. Not rage, not grief, just the flat, final clarity of a door being closed. You told me a shadow with a heart was a shadow that could be stepped on. You were right, but you were talking about yourself. He reached into his jacket and placed a tablet on the edge of Juan's desk, turned face up so the elder could see the screen. The document open on it was a transfer confirmation, $23 million. The shelter's name. She already did the last part. I just came to make sure you saw it. He walked to the door. The Singapore auditors want your cooperation. I'd recommend giving it. The alternative is the other file, the one with the names. Joyce decided to hold that one back for now. She's generous that way. He paused at the threshold. More generous than you deserved. He left. He did not look back. Some endings didn't require a last word. They required the discipline to simply walk away. And for the first time in 15 years, KP Me understood the difference between the two. 6 months later, the penthouse was different. Not structurally. The glass walls were still there. The Chicago skyline still pressed its face against the windows at night. The chandelier still threw its soft, scattered light across the marble floors. But the atmosphere had changed completely, the way a room changes not when you repaint it, but when the people inside it change. The air was warmer. There were things on surfaces now, books, a half-empty wine glass, a throw blanket on the sofa in a particular shade of green that Joyce had chosen and that had no tactical function whatsoever, and that KP Me looked at sometimes, in passing, and felt something it had taken him a long time to correctly identify. Gratitude. For the green blanket, for the fact of its ordinariness, for the extraordinary gift of being allowed, after everything, back into the ordinary. The syndicate had become sediment, the layered geological record of a life. Its hierarchy was dismantled. The Triad Singapore branch had spent 4 months conducting the audit that Juan's machinations had triggered. And the resulting restructuring had been the quiet kind of institutional collapse that looked like reorganization from the outside. From the inside, it was an ending. KP Me's role in it had been to stand at the edge of a world he had given 20 years to, and for the first time, not try to save it. He had let it go. He was now, officially and exclusively, the silent security architecture behind Suite J International, Joyce's expanding entertainment and real estate operation, which had grown in the 6 months since the syndicate's dismantling into something that occupied 3 cities and had an events arm, a talent management division, and a development fund for Southside arts education that Miss Rana chaired and took extremely seriously. KP Me sat in no meetings. He appeared on no masthead. He moved through the operations security infrastructure the way he'd always moved, quietly, completely, leaving no trace. Joyce called him her ghost, but he had told her once that ghosts didn't get to have coffee preferences. She had looked at him with the corner of her mouth curved and said, "This one does." It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The city was doing what it always did at this hour, breathing slow, keeping its secrets, letting the people who lived inside its dark hours have them undisturbed. Joyce was at the piano, not composing exactly. She was in that in-between state that the people who loved her had learned to recognize, half present, half inside the music, her fingers finding things on the keys that didn't have names yet. Her hair was loose and full around her shoulders, spilling down the back of a silk robe the color of deep water. Her feet were bare on the pedals. In the amber glow of the single lamp she'd left on, the rings on her right hand caught the light as her fingers moved. The gold band she'd put back on 3 months ago, placed there quietly, without ceremony. Because she had decided that the marriage she had now was not the same marriage she'd been given, and it deserved a different beginning. He came up behind her. Not silently. He was past pretending he didn't want her to know he was there. He placed a glass of her wine on the top of the piano, and then his hands found her shoulders, and he felt the precise moment her body registered his touch, the small adjustment, the easing, the particular way she leaned back into his presence with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided they were allowed this. He stayed there. Just that. His hands on her shoulders, her warmth against him, the music continuing under her fingers like it had always known this was where the song was going. After a moment she said, without stopping playing, "You should be asleep." "I know. Come to bed when I finish this part. I'll wait." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him, but oriented toward him, the way a plant orients toward light without making a production of it. The corner of her mouth. He pressed his lips to the side of her head, stayed there a breath longer than necessary. Her perfume, sandalwood and something warm, and underneath it, finally, nothing that didn't belong to her. The burner phone on the side table vibrated. They both looked at it. A single message. Unknown sender. "The New York branch is asking for the nightmare by name." Joyce looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at KP Me. He looked back at her. There was no alarm in either of them, no spike of fear, no gearing up for something unwanted. Just the quiet, charged awareness of two people who had walked through enough to know their own weight. "Let them ask," KP Me said. His voice was low, close to her ear. Joyce's eyes returned to the keys. She began a new phrase, something brighter than what had come before, something that moved forward. They should know, she said, that the nightmare doesn't travel alone anymore. His arms closed around her from behind. She kept playing. Outside, Chicago glittered cold and vast and indifferent. Inside the penthouse, something that had been broken for 5 years, not shattered, but slowly, deliberately fractured, held its new shape in the amber light. And in the morning, but it would still be there. That was the thing about the kind of love that had been tested against silence and fear and years of deliberate distance and had survived not through luck, but through the particular stubborn intelligence of a woman who had decided that if she was going to stay, she was going to win. It didn't need to be protected anymore. It had already proven it could protect itself. And that is where Sweet J and KP Me's story rests, not ends. Because people like this don't end. They evolve, but rests for now in the 3 o'clock in the morning quiet of a penthouse that used to be a cage and became, against every odd, a home. If this story moved you, if you were here from the very beginning, if you watched Joyce build her empire in the silence a man gave her, if you saw KP Me choose the flame over the family, then you already know this channel is not like the others. We don't do ordinary here. Hit that subscribe button right now and stay inside this world with us. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Are you Team Joyce from the beginning, or did KP Me earn his way back to your good side by the end? Because that is a conversation I genuinely want to have. If you want part 2, because New York is calling and the nightmare travels in pairs now, like this story, share it with someone who needs a Joyce in their life. And comment part 2 below. When we hit the number, we go back in. From wherever you are tonight, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until 3 o'clock in the morning. Sweet J would appreciate that.